in the first learning outcome, what we did was we primarily looked at understanding the role of public sector. So in the second learning outcome, what we have to do is basically understand, what is the role of private sector as far as, tourism and hospitality industry is concerned. So what I've done is I've put together a few slides, but apart from these slides, what I'm also going to do is give you a bit of a reading to look at. The reason I would probably say, I think in one of the handouts, which is the evaluate task, the role of entrepreneurship, this is a vast topic. And the reason I say it's a bit of a vast topic is because, this is a unit on its own when we look at entrepreneurship, when we look at the in terms of, when individuals look at running family businesses, that at some point in time, these businesses have become very successful and, gone on to become multi-million-dollar or, global organizations. So here in the context of entrepreneurship, we have to basically look at studying, what is entrepreneurship and its concept within the tourism and hospitality industry. So what I've done is I've got a bit of a journal and, a bit of a research paper which has been published. And this research paper primarily, kind of clearly concises and provides concise information in terms of what is entrepreneurship, why is it important within the tourism and hospitality sector, and what are the key benefits of, introducing entrepreneurship. It talks about how this has been adopted in the European Union. So again, a contextual point of view that, it could be applied elsewhere, the Far East, in the Americas, South America, Africa, but gives you some sort of an idea in terms of what is the concept. And I've picked out a few important points from this particular handout when we look at, the third learning outcome that we will cover. But the first two are fairly simple. We're going to discuss them before I get into the individual assessments or the tasks which have been given. We will cover the broad concept by looking at a bit of a background. And then once the foundation is set, what we're going to do is get into understanding individually in what task, what kind of evidence you'll have to basically present. So if I do a quick recap, we know that, very clearly that this is one of the largest tourism and hospitality sector is one of the largest employers of, people across the globe. It is the number one sector in terms of, creating demand, jobs, economic demand as far as, the different countries are concerned. It is widely acknowledged by fact that, and by research that this sector, creates a lot of economic, sociological activity which benefits the human society in general. So more so is quite true because in the present times when affordability, the infrastructure in terms of rail, road, transport and air have become available, and this has been facilitated by a rapid growth of industrialization, advancements in technology. Tourism is becoming all the more important because people are now able to travel across geographies, not just for leisure or vacation activities, but also for other things, which is primarily business, which is one of the key drivers of driving tourism as a sector, but also some of the other things that we are going to pick up, and for you just in particular, but some of the other things that we've discussed in other units, things like MICE, which is meeting incentives, conferences and exhibitions, which is become a very large, area of interest within the tourism and hospitality sector. The other things that we do generally get to see is that, obviously, because this sector has close workings both from public and private partnerships or public and private sector, we do get to see as the sector is expanding, what is happening is that there is a large scale growth happening specifically for companies, because some of these companies then do provide, and the products and services which the companies offer actually go across various geographies. So if we have a tour operator or a website which is advertising holiday packages or vacations or products which is within this industry, their products and services actually are advertised here but could be utilized elsewhere in the world. So when I look at airlines, for example, just to prove this point, when we look at airlines, what we do get to see is that they would advertise packages, but some of these airlines would actually fly passengers in terms of delivering the actual service outside the UK. So when you go out on vacations, when you travel, you're on business, what is happening is they're advertising for the UK geography, but most people may be traveling to Spain, Italy, Greece, North Africa, all over the world. And that is where the services tend to be, actually very differentiated, because it's the source and origin is actually happening within a country, but the delivery of actual some of these actual services and its utilization is happening elsewhere across the globe. The other thing that we do get to see that, there's a lot of transition happening in the tourism industry. The reason when I say transition, and what I mean by transition here is that when we look at talking about how the sector is changing, how quickly it is adapting to the latest trends in technology. And a transition I would say here is if you look at, say, 20, 25 years back, if you look at the early or late 90s, most of the industry was characterized by tour operators, wherein the bookings and everything had to happen, through the route of telephones, and you had a traditional route through which you could do bookings for hotels and book vacations. But when the internet started to penetrate, and when I say the connectivity started to be made available across the globe, what we saw is the upcoming of a lot of websites, and these websites then facilitated easy comparison, say for example, availability of information or detailed information. And in some cases, when you look at the concept of bookings also started happening online. Now this phase is called transition because there's a major change happening within the sector. So earlier bookings were manual, you had huge records of registers and things like that, but at some stage when certain softwares which were introduced like Amadeus, if we look at the booking softwares which are available in the hotel, the availability of inventory was available to the manager, general manager at the touch of a button, because these softwares then made available information required for decision making by the ability of generating reports. So again, that was a bit of a transition. So when you had everything manual, from manual it went to electronic or the use of technology using software that made the booking and inventory system easier. But when this transition is looked at across the globe, you see that this transition is happening throughout the industry, and it is continuously looking at taking up or adapting new technology. And this has led to some of the key players from the ecosystem of the chain also disappearing. So if you look at the role of tour operators, it's become quite niche, or it's now got become very limited to certain geographies wherein some of these advancements are not available in those geographies or countries. And that is where the industry is under transition, is because if you look at budget airlines, there was nothing before 2008, but when Ryanair, EasyJet, and these kind of airlines actually came up, FlyBMI, and some of them which came up in Europe, the accessibility to go to destinations became easier. The ticket costs or the flight tickets costs dropped drastically, and that allowed more and more people to travel. So then air travel became something which is affordable. And that is again a major transition that has happened. So when we see periods of transitions happening within this industry, we see the early 90s, we see the late 2000s, we see, for example, the new set of transitions now happening in the concept of introduction of MICE, which has happened post 2010 in a very big way. And then we look at destination tourism. So when you go to certain countries, when we look at Mauritius, we look at Maldives, we look at, say, tourism in some of the cities in Las Vegas, for example, you look at Macau in China, these are destinations which are predominantly, tourist destinations. So the whole economy is, around that particular destination. You look at Mallorca, Ibiza, some of the most popular destinations in Europe. You see that most of the economic activity is actually around the sector of tourism. And this transition, this has led to a bit of a transition in these locations, because what has happened is it's led to a quick, vast, and detailed infrastructure development of hotels, links, airports, things like that, which has happened, which has facilitated this particular expansion of tourism in these locations. So this is something which is happening all over the globe when we look at tourism industry in general. And that's why this point is quite important, is that there is a transition phase through which this industry is going as new destinations are being discovered, new locations are being added. And this then tends to increase why is this happening? This is happening because of the change of customer preferences, demand from customers, and obviously accessibility to tourists and tourism related activity now happening in developing, underdeveloped, and developed countries. Is that okay? Now, before I go into the role of private sector, what I want to be able to look at is focus on one or two concepts, things like partnerships. Now, because this sector is regulated, is heavily regulated, but the regulation is done by the public sector organizations. And when we look at the expansion, most of the investment direct, when I say foreign direct investment coming in, expansion happening in this is being funded by the private sector. So partnerships is quite important as far as this particular sector is concerned. Sometimes you get to hear this terminology from various governments, various press releases, various sort of information bites which are put out by the government. Sometimes they say that public-private partnership is key to the success of this sector. Now, what they mean by that is sometimes the policies, the legislation, and the conducive environment which is required for businesses to grow and businesses to get confidence to be able to come in and invest is created by the public sector. But most of the investment, in some cases, when I say most, I would say that the government normally would end up providing some sort of a tax break, for example, some sort of an incentive that if you're coming in, setting up an infrastructure here or creating some jobs, then you'll have some reduced rate of tax, or we will have certain benefits which will be passed on to the organization for a period of years, say 3-year, 5-year, 10-year period, because they're looking at regenerating the economy of a particular region or a borough or a county or a state or whatever, depending on the country that you're in. The whole idea of partnership works quite well in this sector is because it looks at creating conducive atmosphere by the propagation of policies, legislative framework, and the confidence that the businesses require for them to be able to come in and invest. So partnership is key, and partnership is defined, by Kernahan as he basically says that when you look at the relationship of sharing power, work, information, and support to achieve a common goal, that is what he defines as partnership. And here in this sector, when you look at partnerships, there are a lot of successful. The image here basically talks about successful elements of partnership. So it requires basic things like communication, the ability to be having leadership. You look at government being decisive in terms of providing concrete policies which allow the private sector to make decisions. They deregulate the sector to a certain extent by reducing policies and legislation or the amount of bureaucracy which is required to be able to set up a business or run a business, and all that is required. So there's a bit of an interdependency between the two, the government and the private companies, to be able to come in and invest, and that is why in this sector they go in. Obviously, in any other sector also they go hand in hand, but more so in the tourism sector, because some of the benefits, for example, when you look at, I go back to the same example of when we look at Olympics, for example. Now, there's a lot of money which the government actually spends. When a country bids for the Olympics, the Olympic Committee, and when they go and look at bidding for that, there's a lot of infrastructure which leads, a lot of investment is done by the government to be able to create the infrastructure required to run a mega event like that for a number of days or weeks. Now, in that, you see the investment coming in the initial side of investment coming in from the public sector, which is the government. But the private sector props up the requirements where it is required in order to make that event possible. Because at the end of it, the investment benefits the generations to come because it creates economic regeneration or creates an economic activity. But the private businesses end up reaping that benefit because when they look at awarding of tenders for construction of stadiums, say residential villages, blocks, things like that, whatever are required, you see the private sector benefiting from it. But it's the public sector which comes in and drives that as a program, as an initiative, which then gives benefit to that particular economy or that city or that country for a number of years to come. So partnership in this sector is quite important, and the government always in any country comes out with a lot of consultations and white papers in order to look at upping, or say for example coming up with the new policy, or when they look at major changes, they look at introducing white papers and obviously consultation exercises to involve the private sector, because this then looks at, as I mentioned, goes back to the first link of the job creation, which it creates, and because it's the largest creator of jobs in the economy, that is where the participation of the public sector versus private sector is quite important. This concept is called the PPP, private public sector partnerships. So what we look at in this is that there is obviously benefits to both sides. The government benefits from a point of view of increased GDP or the increased economic activity which is happening, and the business side of things basically, benefit from the fact that they look at, economic benefits which are long-term from a point of view, either getting sustained tax breaks. They also look at, obviously revenue generation. And in some cases, some businesses see this as an opportunity to expand to newer locations or offer new services, because the government is providing soaps, or as we call them, incentives under these partnerships. Now, I have covered some benefits, which are things like how does government reduce its involvement? How does the government reduce the risk in terms of, investing into it directly rather than invest directly, but in this case, invite private investment. They look at cost reduction, because sometimes you see outsourcing happening in this department. So again, going back to the single example that I discussed of Olympics, you see that Group 4 security, because it's an event which requires security as well. You see G4S was awarded a contract worth 65 million. Now, one company which will maintain security across the venues, across the events for a period of 35, 40 days, Olympics and the Paralympics happening. This also creates, the government could obviously provide security, but in order to look at reducing the cost, direct costs, sometimes you will see private sector gets a lot of these large contracts. An example of G4S here, and this leads to reduction in terms of, the cost or the immediate cost that the government has to, or the spend that the government has to do in order to look at, providing, these services. So there are lots of benefits which I've discussed, and I'm just highlighting them in bold. The reason why I discuss these benefits is because we need to understand why the concept of partnership is important and how does that pan out. What are the benefits which the private and public sector actually gets when we look at this kind of a partnership happening within this particular sector. So any questions on this so far? Okay. Now, when we look at going to the main topic of learning outcome 2, to understand the role of private sector, this slide was specifically put in keeping in mind the question earlier. So we differentiate between private and public sector. But if I look at what is a private sector organization first, a private sector organization, what is it? Before we get into what is private sector within tourism, but can we look at what is private sector first within, in general, within business? Can you look at defining what is private sector within business? In general, when we say classification, yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's maybe a business or company that has been created or founded by an individual, really.
Yes. So when that's correct. So when you look at private sector, Justin, any comments on that side from your end? So when you look at private sector in particular, just resharing the screen back in a second. When we look at the private sector in general, we talk about things like businesses which are going to be set up in the form of sole traders, partnership. You look at limited companies, and these are companies which primarily are set up as entities which are doing commercial activities, and these commercial activities primarily, are done from a point of view of generating profits. So when we look at private sector in general, what we do see is that most of these organizations within the private sector tend to be, organizations which will, I would say, provide, certain type of services, but these services are primarily going to be commercial. So when I look at, just refreshing my screen because it got stuck. So when we look at, private sector, the classification of private sector primarily tends to be the concept of companies which are set up for some sort of commercial activity to bring or make profits in lieu, they receive some benefits, or when they provide products and services, offer products and services to consumers, they get some benefits in terms of revenue or turnover. Now, when we look at private sector, the classification is quite clear. When we look at private sector organizations, the classification includes things like sole trader, you have partnerships, you have public limited companies, you have limited companies, private limited companies, you have limited liability companies, and in some cases you'll have some organizations which are classified as private sector organizations, but they do not generally have activities to create profits. They would be classified as something called charities. I wouldn't probably say private sector, but they would be classified as something called, charities. So when we look at different types of organizations, similarly, when we know what is a private sector organization run for the intention of making profit, run primarily, by a set of individuals or a group of companies or people who are looking at making profit from the products and services they offer. This is where you will say this is private sector. But now when we look at private sector and the definition of private sector within tourism, what we look at, and this is something that I picked up from Google in terms of Wikipedia, would be looking at, they are referring to businesses which operate within this sector alone. So I know that when I say Marks and Spencer, or when I say Tesco, or when I look at Carrefour, or when I look at Walmart, or when I look at, say, Michelin tires, every type of organization that you can think of which is private, they are private businesses, they are private organizations. But do they provide services related to the private sector? Probably not. So when we say private sector, we are relating to organizations which directly or indirectly provide services within this sector alone. That means their bread and butter actually comes from working within this sector. So if I have a manufacturing company which makes parts for cars, but they also produce raw material which is utilized to create, the chassis or the bodies or the engine of the cars, but they are primarily supplying and making or manufacturing only these things, which is engine parts of the cars and things like that. They are in the automobile sector. So their bread and butter and their main business is actually automobile sector. Similarly, when I classify businesses like hotels, I can obviously provide services as a hotel to conferences, meetings, events, marriages, birthday parties, things like that, to stay to customers overnight, or, look at tourists. But the main activity is bed and breakfast. The main activity is overnight stay. But can they work in and provide services in any other sector? Probably not. So there might be a case wherein, for example, if a large delegation comes in, they might rent the whole hotel, or the organization might rent the whole place for a couple of weeks or months. But still, again, it is being used as a service which is for lodging, boarding, catering, things like that. So it is still under bed and breakfast. So when we talk about private sector organizations, we are talking about organizations which are predominantly providing direct or indirect services within this sector. Examples of these companies would be, when we look at companies like Airbnb, we look at, Virgin Atlantic as airlines, you look at some of the hotels, you look at some bus operators like National Express, Megabus. These are all private companies which are predominantly providing travel activities, transport activities, entertainment activities within this sector. And that is why we classify them as what is called the private sector organizations. Is that okay? Okay, good stuff. Now, having said that, what we also want to briefly look at would be what are the various, characteristics that you will see of organizations working within, the tourism sector. What can be the characteristics, or what are the key things which define these organizations within the tourism sector? Can you think of some key things?
The main thing is that, as you said, they're more for profit.
Yeah. Justin, can you think of a few things in terms of what are the key? Think of some of the key things which are key components, or I would say
a unique service, I believe. Their type of service that they provide. Everybody is doing it for income, but what type of service would they provide? For example, different hotels provide different service. It all comes down to the service, the promotion. For example, there's a difference between a 5-star hotel and a 3-star hotel. That's what makes it a 5-star hotel, is the service and what they provide and how they provide it.
Correct. So if you look at what you mentioned is correct, and what Selena mentioned is also correct. But in order to understand what is the basic element of making that industry up, we have to think of services of the kind of features or functions this provides. So if I buy a cell phone, I know I'm buying the cell phone, or a mobile phone. I'm buying it for using it as what? Maybe for talking, chatting, using applications on it, browsing the internet, sending emails. So those are the features, or the reasons, or the usages of why we buy the cell phone. So similarly, when we look at the characteristics of the organizations within this sector, what we are looking at in particular is when we talk about the various characteristics, we are primarily looking at understanding what kind of services, what kind of experience. We would also say what kind of facilities these organizations would provide. So looking at three key aspects: services, benefits, or key features which these companies would exhibit would actually form what is called the characteristics of this organization. So just very briefly recapping, now last time also this is a bullet point that I put in to say that what are the key main industries within the tourism and hospitality sector. So when we look at the key industries or the key type of services which this sector provides, you look at accommodation. Now I won't probably go into defining bed and breakfast, hotels, resorts, things like that, but they are all under accommodations. You look at restaurants, food and catering and things, so that is under food and beverage. You look at recreation, any form of recreation, religious travel, travel for vacation, travel for business, all under recreation. You have entertainment, you have transportation and travel. So these are the five key, main kind of sectors within, or industries within the tourism sector. Now, if I have to define the characteristics, so if I have to do it, I have to pick up one type of organization. So if I have to pick up one type of organization, say for example, if I pick up something like transportation. Now, transportation also is of different types. It can be done by rail, road, air, and sea. But when you pick up, say for example, you're deciding to go on a cruise, or as a holiday you want to go on a cruise with your family. What are the key things that which will help you in making that decision that I should choose this cruise versus this company offering versus that company offering? The differentiation that you will do will be on the basis of the characteristics of the key USPs which each of the cruise liner or the cruise companies would be providing. So you might have 7-day, 6-night, 7-day holiday, and all of them, the price might be $1,200, $1,400, $1,299, but the services might include a welcome drink, daily change of linen, facilities like the bar, the spa, say the gym, some of the other key, entrances to say certain events and things like that would be free in some £1,400, package per person. But then $1,299, they'll give you a welcome drink and this and a couple of things, and then in the lowest one you'll have certain differentiation. So these are characteristics or things which is in terms of directly in this case we are classifying it in relation to money, but they are basically things which are going to be directly related to the services, the experience, or the facilities that you're going to use when you are on the cruise. Okay. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Does that explain in terms of what do I mean by characteristics?
It does. One question though, if I may ask. Comparing this to the characteristics of the, it's kind of similar. If I have to say, can you, for example, provide one example of a characteristic, not about the private but about the public industry?
So when we look at the actual meaning of the word characteristic, how do we define the word characteristic? We normally think of a place, person, thing, or some sort of a thing that you can tangibly associate with. So when you look at a characteristic, what I would probably do in that case would be, when I say characteristic of a public sector organization, you are going to be talking about things which are going to be related to things like the services they provide, which are going to be services for greater good. So one of the characteristics of a public sector organization would be the type of service they provide. And in this case, if I look at a service which they need to provide, could be done in accordance with some sort of rules and regulations which the government or the government has set for the market. So if we look at the characteristic of public sector organization, when you look at, say, let me think of, say, when you visit a tourist destination and you are going to be visiting that particular destination, what you will see is that it will allow you to visit that place by paying a certain amount of fees. And that fees will be same irrespective of any other type of person visiting that location. And I will differentiate that with the private sector. So, for example, if you go and visit, say, another destination wherein it is under the control of private sector, what you will see is a bit of a tiered structure which comes in. You have a bronze pass, you have a silver pass, you have a VIP entry, and what they tend to do is you have a fast track entry, and they tend to differentiate that service by charging you a bit more premium on the cost or price, and you're able to fast track it because it's a service being offered by the private sector. An example that I would give you is when you go to a lot of theme parks, or when you go to, say, certain places of interest, if you're visiting a place of interest, say the Chrysler building in, say, for example, New York. Now, you can go to the building, there's a 2-hour waiting queue, but that's a public service which is offered by the Chrysler building. So if you have to come in, you have to go there, there's a standard ticket of maybe $50, and then you have to go up, depending on the traffic, whatever it is. Everybody can go up and, have a good view of the city or, the Big Apple. But there is also a service which is operated within the same building by a private operator. And this allows you to get access to this public building, which is for tourist activity purposes, but by paying a certain amount of premium to get entry to that, location. And that allows you to, the ticket price is $100. And what happens is if you don't need to be in the queue, you can skip the queue. And when there are people who have this private entry passes coming through, the attendant there would say, okay, move aside, please make way. We've got some private, passes, private access people coming through, and they get access to the lift first. Everybody is pushed aside, they get access to the lift because they paid that premium to be able to avail that service. But because it's being offered through a private organization and in a public building, it is done through the private route. That is a private example, which is a characteristic. But when I look at the location that you're visiting in general through the normal route of booking through the website and going through the government or the semi-government organization which is providing that service, you will see that you have to go through the normal queue of, buying a standard price in terms of ticket, queuing up, and then waiting your turn to go up to the, the 80th floor to see Big Apple. Does that differentiate? Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, good stuff. So I think when we look at here, public and private sector, I think what we need to be able to look at is dive into straight away the type of services they provide, and that will give you an example or help you to differentiate between, why we are looking at the classification of private and public sector. So it's the services, the experience, and the facilities they provide, and how they are, provided to the consumers would help you differentiate the definition of private and public sector. Now, when we look at, when we say characteristics, so we are just taking to that point here, what we are looking at in particular is when we look at private companies, they are obviously making profits, but companies which derive most of their bread and butter, which is coming in primarily from selling of these tourism, hospitality, related services within this sector would be classed as private sector companies within this industry. So when we look at airlines as an example, you look at Virgin Atlantic, you look at, when I say airlines, you'll have to also be quite picky in the sense because some of these airlines also provide normal services which are for travel, but when they advertise in particular for say a tourist or a tourist activity or a full package holiday, where they are giving you the flights, the hotel stay and everything, they tend to provide most of the services within the umbrella or under the umbrella of something called tourism, and that is where the tourism and hospitality services come in. But if you're flying by Virgin Atlantic on a business tour or on a business meeting, and you're going from Manchester to London and London onwards to say Frankfurt or London onwards to say New York, you're predominantly going for a business trip, and that is not going to be classed as the primary activity when you consider Virgin Atlantic from that point of view. But the moment you say I'm flying from Gatwick and I'm going to Florida to Disney Park, all the services end to end from booking, stay, flights, transfer, and your accommodation is all provided by Virgin Atlantic Holidays, that would be classed as a private sector organization, and the characteristic of that organization being it is under Virgin Atlantic's umbrella, but the company is Virgin Atlantic Holidays, which is providing all these services. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are some examples, obviously I've taken in slide 2, which is of the Marriott Hotel. So here the idea is that Marriott Hotel is a private sector business. If you look at Hilton Hotels, for example, over the years, the name and the brand has got associated with reputation, certain prestige, and the classification of hotels. But over the years and how the business has expanded across geographies, across the decades, I should say, not years, what we have seen is that some of these brands have started to look at differentiation in terms of how they provide this service in a particular geography. So the concept of franchising came in, but franchising is again a private sector concept, not a public sector concept. So when you look at McDonald's, you look at Subways, you look at KFCs, you look at lots of these companies, what they've done is they've chosen to grow as a business by franchising some of the key aspects of their brand, and the services are then provided by the local partner, but they control branding, promotion, with the way you serve the customer, the corporate ethics, everything is controlled tightly by the head office or the organization. So when you look at, again, private sector, they have introduced this concept of franchiseship, and what has helped them to do over the years and decades is that they've been able to develop this model into something called a managed franchise model, which again is one of the characteristics when you look at businesses growing, private sector heavily investing within this sector. When I say private companies investing heavily within the tourism sector, you will see that this is a concept that they have brought in, and again this differentiates them from public sector companies. You see that there are some national airlines, but these national airlines are in the control of the government. So some of the countries still have national airlines. We had British Airways up until I think 70s, if I can remember correctly, 70s or 80s. But when it was privatized, sold out to the buyer, it is a national carrier. It is referred to as a national carrier, but the ownership of this company lies in the private hands, or in IAG or the consortium, and they own Iberia and obviously British Airways, along with some of the other brands that they have within this umbrella. But essentially, it's a private limited company now. It's controlled by it's in the private hands. But when we refer to British Airways, the name, for the name's sake, it feels as if it's a national carrier. But the differentiation is quite clear. It was a public sector or a public sector enterprise up until I think the 1970s or 80s. But after that, when it was privatized, it has become a private sector company, and the shares and the holdings of the shares of this company is with the general public, because the share of British Airways is trading on different stock exchanges, and that is what also differentiates when we look at a private sector organization from a public sector organization. Most of the shares and control is with the government, but in this case, the private sector organizations, which are large companies, organizations, can have ownership, with shareholders or people who are outside the remit of the day-to-day working of the organization. Okay. Last but not the least, I'm going to come to the third assessment criteria, which is primarily looking at the role of entrepreneurship. Now, what we want to be able to understand with the concept of entrepreneurship is, first of all, when we talk about, definition of entrepreneurship, what we look at is, if I literally define it, it's a concept from which, you look at small businesses. When you have the ability to be able to run a business, you create a business, you run a small business, and that business then becomes big. And at some stage, people who help in managing that transition, from the company going from a small set of operations to a large operation, they are classed as what are called the entrepreneurs. That means people who have the ability to be able to create a profitable business from nothing, or starting an operation from zero or nothing, and then creating it into an operation which generates revenue, profits, jobs, creates jobs, is the concept of entrepreneurship. But entrepreneurs, essentially. And when we look at that concept in total, what we do see is that is what is defined as entrepreneurship is because it's the ability to be able to build that capacity or, the capability in that business for the business to grow, and for the business to, successively grow to be able to become a large business, from a small business to a large business. Now we look at the concept of family-run businesses. A lot of these shops, mom and pop shops, as we call them, mom and pop businesses. When you look at Tesco as an example, just as a parallel from the retailing sector, started off in the 1920s, was a one outlet, but after the World War, in the early 1940s, the owner came up with the concept of franchising the stores. One led to the other. Then by in the 50s they had about 100 stores, and slowly and gradually, as the money started to come in from different sources, which is basically investment coming in from different sources, what happened is the business was able to grow, and today it is a multi-billion dollar or a multi-billion pound business, which has operations in about 14 or 15 countries, employs more than 250 or 270,000 people across 14 countries. So here, the concept of entrepreneurship is important, because somebody started off this as a unique concept, came up with the ideas, that idea became the concept led to the creation of the business, but the scalability in that business was brought across by one or two individuals, which scaled it up to a certain level. But after that, when the management stepped in, the operational side of things stepped in, the whole concept of transforming that small business into a large or a mega global business, whatever you call it, is done through the concept of something called entrepreneurship. So here, if I have to define entrepreneurship, what we typically would look at is saying it's a process of designing, launching, and running a new business, which is initially starting off as a small business, but shows you the green shoots of becoming a large business over a point in time, if certain decisions and factors in terms of investment are done right. So the same concept that we look at is with what we are going to apply here in the case of tourism and hospitality sector. And here what we want to understand is how entrepreneurship comes into this sector and what does it entail and provide in order to, when I say entail, basically contribute towards this sector. So what we realize is, especially from an example of UK, when we look at, there are about 3.2 million businesses which are big and small businesses, which actually make up this sector. So when you look at within that sector, 1.8 million of them, just showing some statistics, 1.8 million of them actually are directly within this tourism and hospitality sector. Now, they are big, small businesses which allow various services to be offered, whether it's across accommodations, food and beverage, travel, and recreation, those kind of 5 sectors that we look at. Now, why is entrepreneurship important? Entrepreneurship is important because if the government has to bring in and introduce policy, and with that policy they have to bring in what you call new investment, they have to create that atmosphere through which there are new people who come in and start businesses which can offer products and services within this sector. So their main aim is to look at implementing policies or programs which actually stimulate the growth of or creation of these businesses. You will see that sometimes, the government holds or there are events which happen throughout the world, which basically are events to promote the creation of business or, startup of new companies. So we look at a lot of these startup trolls, which, do events across the globe. And there's one such happening, in Germany, I think, next month, wherein they're inviting all startup businesses within the European Union to come in and participate, how they can scale up that business. Now, these kind of events are basically promoted or sponsored by the government because they want new investment to come into the economy or people to be able to come up with ideas and concepts to start new business. The main goal of doing all this at the policy level is to stimulate economic growth, is to stimulate creation of jobs. Now, when we look at this particular role with this particular objective, the businesses come in and play a role wherein they look at creating. When I say individuals come in creating businesses, and these businesses then create employment, and as the businesses start to grow, they create growth, economic growth, employment growth, job growth, whatever you call it. Now, that is the concept of what we want to look at in terms of entrepreneurship as far as tourism is concerned. So when we look at big, small businesses within the EU, there are 22.1 million small, medium enterprises in the EU in the 28 countries. And this data is slightly old, so it has jumped up to about 31 million. And this represents about almost, as you can see, 199% of what the European economy generates in terms of revenue. And when I say what it generates growth, innovation, employment, and obviously greater, social integration or greater participation from people within, the countries to promote this economic activity of business. So when we look at all this, they also created something called the Small Business Act for Europe, and that is called the SPA. This was adopted by the European Union, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to facilitate quicker growth or formation of small companies which could come up with concepts and ideas which are going to be unique, and they would be able to offer products and services to different other large businesses, consumers in general within within the European Union. So when we look at the concept of entrepreneurship, what we are primarily looking at is understanding the key reasons why the government looks at creating platform, legislation, policy, or consultations for individuals to come in and invest to be able to grow this particular sector. So in conclusion, if I look at, when you look at the concept of entrepreneurship, what we do see a lot of family-run businesses. So when we look at bed and breakfast in the UK in particular, B&Bs, they are essentially what are family-run businesses. They are small, businesses which offer the facilities of overnight stay, lodging, or the facility of having meals when people travel to smaller destinations. Now, it is not going to be practically viable for Marriott or Hilton or some of the other big hotel chains like Crown Plaza to open up a hotel wherein you only have seasonality of tourism. So here they have to be dependent on small businesses which basically come in and fill that gap and fill that market demand by offering those services in that location. So you look at if you look at UK in general as an economy, you see large cities, 20, 25 of them have good infrastructure, hotels, and various types for consumers to come in and obviously take use of or make use of tourism and tourism related activity. But if I look at it in Scotland, you have Edinburgh, you have Glasgow, you have Aberdeen, you have Dundee, and you have some other places wherein you can go in and travel and stay in hotels. But rest of the other places that you go, you'll be lucky enough to find a 5-star hotel or something which is a 3 or 4-star bed and breakfast. And that is where the concept of entrepreneurship comes up, is because the demand is not that large. In some places, you will have smaller businesses, family-run businesses coming in and filling that gap to be able to service the market when it comes to the tourist or hospitality activity. So when we look at the concept of entrepreneurship, we need to understand it from that aspect, that where it comes in, how it helps to grow the industry, how it creates employment, and last but not the least, when we look at in terms of understanding what kind of role it plays a very significant role, because the SMEs or the small medium enterprises, which are all the outcome or output of entrepreneurship within this sector, in the UK alone, creates job opportunities for 1.2 to 1.8 million employees, at the national level. The reason the figure varies is because of the seasonality of the demand. So there are seasons in which, like the summer, for example, you look at the autumn, when there's a lot of tourist activity within the UK, the employment jumps up. But when you look at going into the quieter months or the winters, or when you look at other months of the year, you will see that this, because of seasonality and the reduction in tourism activity, the employment level actually comes down to 1.2, 1.3 million. So these are what are called, the actual contributors to generating, employability and job. Let's put it this way: job creation and economic growth in areas wherein you do not get, large tourism. So when I look at France, for example, I look at Paris. Paris gets about 35 million visitors every year. But if I look at inner places within France, you look at Clermont-Ferrand, you look at Lyon, you look at some of the other destinations, you will see that the tourism activity decreases in those places. So in order to support and keep the whole economy and the sector contributing, the role of entrepreneurs and the concept of entrepreneurship steps in, because there are these small, medium businesses which come in, step into that role, and obviously provide some of these services, fill in the gaps in those locations to provide services for tourism activity. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
That's so far.
Okay, stop. So what I'm going to do is, after the session, I'm going to upload the copy of this presentation. I wanted to refresh the presentation as well, so the earlier version is slightly outdated. This is the new version. So you will see the LO2 as the presentation. Specifically for the concept of entrepreneurship, I'm going to upload this particular handout, which I think is a bit of a good read, which gives you some context and background in terms of why the role of entrepreneurship is important and how this has come to some sort of occupy some sort of an importance within the sector because of the seasonality and the risks involved when we look at tourism and hospitality activity in general across any geography. Okay, good stuff. So what we'll do is, I don't think there's a scheduled next session, but keeping in mind whatever we get an agreement on, what we're going to try and do is schedule that session, even if it comes on the weekend, and we'll try and cover the learning outcome 3, for that session then.
Okay.
Okay. In the meanwhile, any questions, queries, please feel free to drop me an email or, obviously on WhatsApp, whichever is convenient. We'll take it from there.
Sure. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Good stuff. Thanks, Selina. Any questions from you, Justin?
Yes, thank you. Can I ask you one last question, if I may, or do you have to go?
No.
Okay. Because about the presentation that we will doing for, let's say, from 1.1 till 2.3.
Yes.
A lot of the base, for example, when I'm presenting the presentation, I won't have everything in full detail because basically I'm going to be speaking in full detail from behind the presentation I'm presenting. Do I need to provide you as well everything that I'm going to talk about apart from the presentation, about the presentation?
I'm going to quickly look at opening up the assignment brief and give you a quick guidance here. The reason I want to do that is when you're looking at addressing the criteria, let's quickly look at it from that point of view.
Because basically, I'm going to be addressing the criteria by voice. What I'm going to have is a presentation, and on the presentation, I'm going to have everything, but as not in detail. For example, I'm going to provide everything in detail by my voice instead of the presentation. Precisely, that's the topic I'm going to be talking about, for example.
So if I look at just the quick, thing on the assignment brief, if I just bring that up right now,
okay.
what I want to be able to do is, if I look at, this is the assignment brief for this unit, unit 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, given the learning outcomes and the assessment criteria on this side, that's fine. But if I look at the actual scenario in which what they've asked you to do is, if you see, they're asking you to basically look at, you're working as a tour operator in a public organization, you're applying for a job of associate lecturer for a public college, and in addition to the job interview, you're required to deliver a mini lesson to gauge the ability. Your lesson should have a presentation element and a case study. So here, if you see this particular presentation that you're going to draw, and maybe a bit of a handout in the form of a case study or like an article that you do, would actually cover assessment criteria 1.1 to 2.3. So that means learning outcome 1 and learning outcome 2. So here, if I, as a learner, I have to do this, what I'm going to do is, it says deliver a mini session comparing, contrasting public and private sector organizations. So if I look at starting off with a presentation, and in that presentation, if I briefly, let me see, public versus private sector organization.
Can I give you just one example from it?
Yeah.
For example, just a second, I need to open something up. For example, I'm going to be, let's say, I'm speaking about the public sector. And I just provide a few factors of what is the role of the public sector as bullet points, but not in detail. But for example, I'll be presenting the presentation. I'll say, let's look at bullet 1. It's about the enforcement of that type of law. Then I start talking in detail, because that was my idea of doing the presentation. Because then it would be a very long presentation. I don't want to be reading. I want to be explaining what's on the presentation.
Sure. So here, that's fine.
That would be perfect, I think. I wanted your opinion on it, that's why.
It will be better, yes, that's okay. So it says
Thank
public
you.
and private sector in tourism. So I've just opened up one random presentation from a learner. Obviously, she has done T&L Lewis, which is a a company within the clothing brand. They make shirts and suits and stuff. Now she's done a bit of a classification of introduction to the organization, but she's talked about private sector. But she hasn't done. This is primarily specific to private sector. But here, what I would suggest is when you start off the presentation, in this case, what I would do is basically you can take a organization which is in the tourism sector. So if I look at, say, for example, on the private sector side, maybe, I don't know, I'm just taking Virgin Atlantic because I've discussed this as an example. And on the public sector side, you pick up, say, any sort of a museum trust or anything that you can, think of.
I was gonna talk in general and bring everything in general together. For example, on the government side, I'm gonna bring a lot of government entities and how they are affecting the tourism and the hospitality industry. And on the private sector, I'm gonna speak a few of other stuff instead of a singular.
That's absolutely fine. So what I would suggest is, if I have to ask you to give you some tips in terms of how to arrange the presentation, what I would suggest you do is you write first slide, which is going to be private sector.
An introduction, for example.
Yeah, and then the second would be public sector, and then you go to the characteristics of public sector. Maybe draw up a table in slide 3, wherein you have a table versus public versus private.
I see. To compare, that's why, because you're comparing from you answering the question.
And then you're addressing this point here, so I'm comparing and contrasting, and I'm also talking about the characteristics. And then in basically, when I say one slide, it could be one company, and then you talk about advantages, disadvantages of. So it will be maybe 2 slides for private sector, 2 or 3 slides for public sector, then 4 or 5 slides could be private and public sector being compared. And then you talk about, when I say literally slide 4, you talk about entrepreneurship.
I see. Thank you.
How it comes about, and then maybe towards slide 5, talk about challenges of entrepreneurship. Now, so this way, what you've done is you've addressed every sort of thing which has been asked for. But when I say literally 5 slides, you might end up doing, 8 to 10 slides in total for this right now.
I see. I was planning to do maybe 15 slides maximum.
Yeah, something like that.
Because I'm going in detail, that's why.
Yeah, not more than, say, 15, not more than maybe 15 max. Let's put it this way. But rather than have, if I look at this learner, she has put a lot of text on the slides.
I see. No, I was planning to put simple and precise text, and then I explain that simple and precise text in detail. And
you can explain the text in the speaker notes here underneath. If you do this kind of slides, which are too, I would say, quite worded, then you don't need to do speaker notes because these are good enough. But if you're going to, for example, doing... No,
I wish to present it by voice, that's why, because it's part of the learning experience.
Yeah, that's okay.
I just wanted your opinion because I get worried about everything. I wanted it to be good.
Okay, that's fine. Absolutely okay.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry for keeping you.
No, that's fine. You've not kept me. That's okay. So as long as what my suggestion would be, if you just do say 1 learning outcome or maybe 2 learning outcomes that we've covered and send it back to me, then what I can do is I can give you some feedback. And in that feedback, what I'm going to try and do is give you some detailed feedback, which is going to be, developmental, which is going to say, okay, this is something which is ideological. If you do, that's the best. But this is bare minimum, which is required as per criteria to meet the task. And then if there are any areas of improvement, which could be general areas, generally sometimes people use the word, oh, you've covered this, although, but
what I can send you is, I can finish the presentation. With the presentation, I can give you everything that I'm going to talk from each slide.
Yes.
So that you can have the presentation, the outside of the presentation, and you have in detail explanation about what I'm going to say about each slide.
That would do.
Thank you, Mr. Singh.
No worries.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll catch up with you next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good.